the Apollo 11 mission, which landed men on the moon. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were setting foot on the moon's surface, Michael Collins was piloting the command module.
While billions of eyes were glued to the grainy, flickering ghosts of Neil and Buzz, Michael Collins floated in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Probably half of humanity didn't know about him as the third astronaut. He was the most isolated human to ever live, drifting behind the lunar horizon where even the stars looked different. Deep inside his pocket sat a secret set of instructions for a nightmare scenario. The real story of the third man isn't about what he found, but what he carried, and his revelations will shock you. If Armstrong and Aldrin did not make it. The mission was built on the premise of a triumphant return for three, but Michael Collins spent months rehearsing the logistics of returning as one. While history remembers the moon landing as a singular leap for mankind, for the man orbiting above in the command module Columbia, it was a series of cold, mathematical contingencies. The most haunting of these was the very real possibility that the Eagle, the lunar module carrying Armstrong and Aldrin, would fail to lift off from the lunar surface. If that engine didn't fire, or if it failed halfway through its ascent, Michael Collins was under strict orders to leave his friends behind, to die in the vacuum of space and return to Earth alone. This was not a hidden conspiracy. It was a heavy, calculated reality of 60s engineering. Collins carried a notebook that contained 18 different rendezvous plans, many of which covered what he termed the marooned scenarios. He knew that if the ascent engine failed, there was absolutely nothing he could do to go down and get them. The Columbia wasn't designed to land, and he didn't have the fuel or the hardware to perform a rescue mission on the surface. He would be forced to listen to their voices on the radio until their oxygen ran out, or until they chose a quicker end. And then he would have to fire his own engines to begin the lonely three-day journey back to a planet that would forever view him as the man who came home without his crew. He later described this as a secret terror that sat in the back of his mind for the better part of a year. It wasn't a fear of his own death. Test pilots are professionally trained to compartmentalize the risk of a fiery end, but rather a fear of the social and psychological aftermath. He imagined himself as a marked man, a living ghost. He could see the headlines, the way people would look at him in the grocery store, and the crushing weight of having to face the widows of his friends. This burden of responsibility is something rarely captured in the glossy retrospectives of the era. We like our heroes to be fearless, but Collins was something more impressive. He was functional in spite of a terrifying moral weight. To prepare for this, he had to build a mental wall. He practiced the docking maneuvers until they were muscle memory, focusing on the switches and the gauges to drown out the what-ifs. Yet, the reality of his position meant he was the only person in the universe who truly understood the stakes of the mission's middle ground. If the mission succeeded, he was the pilot. If it failed catastrophically and they all died, he was a martyr. But if it failed only for the two men on the surface, he was the survivor, a role that carried a unique kind of darkness. The documents he carried were chilling in their precision. NASA had prepared a speech for President Nixon to deliver in the event of a lunar disaster. But Collins lived that speech in real time. He had to remain technically perfect, while knowing that his crewmates were essentially standing on a pedestal of volatile chemicals and unproven components. Every time he looked down at the moon's surface, he wasn't just looking at a celestial body. He was looking at a potential tomb for his closest companions. He was the guardian of the exit door, and the possibility that he might have to lock it from the outside was a truth he had to live with every second he was in orbit. This psychological pressure was compounded by the technical isolation. While Neil and Buzz were busy with the high adrenaline task of not crashing, Collins was the CEO of a complex three-room flying machine. He had to manage the life support, the navigation, and the fuel cells, all while maintaining a mental state that could handle a sudden transition from teammate to solitary survivor. He didn't have the luxury of distraction. He had the clock, the gauges, and the view of a world that looked increasingly fragile and distant. It is one thing to face death with others. It is quite another to be the one who has to witness it and then navigate the silence all the way home. He managed this by embracing a certain kind of professional detachment. He focused on the checklists, the burn times, and the orbital mechanics. He turned the life and death drama into a series of problems to be solved. If the engine failed at X altitude, he would perform maneuver Y. By turning the tragedy into a technicality, he protected his sanity. But the shocking truth of his experience wasn't some grand revelation about the moon itself. It was the revelation of what a human mind can endure when it is forced to contemplate the unthinkable while traveling at thousands of miles per hour. But how does a person actually function when the entire world is literally out of sight? The far side and the gold-plated silence. When the Columbia drifted behind the massive curve of the moon, the umbilical cord of human communication was cleanly severed. For 48 minutes of every 2-hour orbit, Michael Collins entered a zone of silence that is almost impossible to replicate on Earth. There was no static, no chatter from Houston, and no voices from the lunar surface. He was shielded from the entire planet by 2,000 miles of solid rock. At that moment, he wasn't just the loneliest man in history. He was the only sentient being in the universe who was truly alone. On the front side of the moon, you can see Earth, a small, blue reminder of home. On the far side, there is only the vast, black void of the cosmos and the battered ancient face of the lunar highlands passing below. The common perception of this isolation is that it must have been haunting or claustrophobic. People imagined him shivering in the dark, desperate to hear a human voice again. But the reality Collins described was the exact opposite. He found a strange gold-plated peace in that silence. He wasn't lonely, he was busy, and more importantly, he was free. For those 48 minutes, he was the absolute master of his domain. He didn't have to answer to mission control, he didn't have to follow a script dictated from a room in Texas, and he didn't have to worry about the optics of the mission. He was simply a pilot flying a machine through the most pristine environment imaginable. In his journals and later reflections, he spoke about the sheer exultation of that time. There was a profound sense of awareness that came with the darkness. He described the far side of the moon as having a different light, a stark, unforgiving clarity where the stars didn't twinkle but shone as steady, unblinking points of light. He was a pioneer in a way that Armstrong and Aldrin weren't. They were explorers of a specific patch of dirt, but he was the explorer of the void itself. He would make himself a cup of coffee, look out the window, and watch the sun rise over the lunar horizon, a spectacle that no other human had ever witnessed with such intimacy. This part of the mission required a unique kind of mental discipline. In the 60s, being out of contact was the ultimate nightmare for a pilot. If something went wrong while he was on the dark side, there was no one to call for help. He would have to diagnose the problem, find the solution, and execute the fix all by himself before the spacecraft emerged back into radio range. He was essentially a one-man fire department, engineer, and navigator. This wasn't a burden to him, it was the ultimate expression of his craft. He had spent years training for this level of autonomy, and there was a deep, professional satisfaction in knowing that he was holding the entire mission together while the world slept. The contrast between his reality and the reality of the two men below was staggering. While Neil and Buzz were focused on the dusty, granular details of the Sea of Tranquility, Collins was seeing the moon as a whole object, a giant, three-dimensional sphere hanging in nothingness. He was seeing the big picture. This perspective allowed him to detach from the ego of the mission. He wasn't thinking about his place in history or the medals he would eventually receive. He was thinking about the machine, the oxygen levels, and the sheer, impossible beauty of the mechanics of the universe. He was in a state of flow that few humans ever achieve, where the self disappears and only the task remains. However, the silence also forced a certain kind of introspection. When you are that far away from everything you've ever known, the things that usually seem important, politics, status, daily grievances, simply evaporate. He looked at the moon and saw a dead, hostile place, a desert of monochrome that offered no welcome. It was beautiful in its desolation, but it was also a reminder of how much of a miracle life really is. He would wait for the moment of acquisition of signal when the crackle of Houston would return to his headset, not with a sense of relief, but with a sense of returning to the fold. He enjoyed his time in the dark, but it served as a powerful preparation for the light. This solitude didn't just change his day, it rewired how he viewed the very ground we stand on. The transition from the silent, dead far side to the sudden, vibrant sight of the Earth rising over the lunar limb was the true surprise of his journey. It wasn't a secret he found in the craters, it was a realization he found in the distance. He realized that the moon was a magnificent place to visit, but a terrible place to stay, and that the blue speck in the distance was far more precious than anyone back home seemed to realize. This solitude didn't just change his day, it rewired how he viewed the very ground we stand on. The fragility of the blue marble. While the world was obsessed with the moon, that giant bone-white trophy in the sky, Michael Collins was having a love affair with the Earth. This was perhaps the most profound shift in his psyche. For most of his life, he had been a man of the air, a test pilot who looked at the sky as a playground for speed and physics. But from a distance of 240,000 miles, the perspective shifted from the mechanical to the biological. He wasn't looking at a map or a political globe. He was looking at a tiny, glowing, incredibly bright sapphire set against a velvet blackness that seemed to go on forever. It looked impossibly small and terrifyingly fragile.
When you look out the window, it's tiny. Being very close to the moon was very impressive in many ways, but the moon is nothing compared to our home.
This shift in vision is often called the overview effect, but for Collins, it was more than just a fleeting awe. It was a fundamental realization that the planet we inhabit is a closed system, a lone life raft in a hostile sea. He noted that from the moon, you can't see borders. You can't see the lines drawn by wars or the walls built by ideology. You just see a swirling, living marble of white clouds and blue oceans. He began to feel that the squabbles of humanity were not just petty, but dangerous. He realized that if we don't treat this tiny blue speck with the utmost care, there is no backup plan. There is no other home waiting for us in the immediate vicinity. The contrast between the two celestial bodies was stark. The moon, up close, was a place of jagged rocks and monotonous grays, a beautiful but utterly dead, magnificent desolation. As Buzz Aldrin put it, there was no water, no wind, no sound, and no life. Then he would look back at the Earth, and the vibrancy was overwhelming. It was the only splash of color in a monochromatic universe. This prompted a deep sense of environmentalism in a man who had previously spent his career burning through thousands of gallons of jet fuel. He became convinced that if every world leader could be strapped into a seat and sent 100,000 miles out to look back at their home, their priorities would shift instantly. He often spoke about how the Earth looked hollow. It didn't look like a solid, indestructible rock. It looked like a Christmas tree ornament that could shatter if you touched it too hard. This wasn't a feeling of power, that he was one of the few humans to ever be above it all, but rather a feeling of intense protectiveness. He felt a kinship with every living thing on that blue dot, because, from his vantage point, everything was part of the same tiny, vulnerable crew. He saw the atmosphere as a thin layer of protection, as delicate as the skin of an onion. This realization made him something of an accidental philosopher. He began to question the way we organize our societies. Why do we focus on the differences when, from the lunar distance, the similarities are the only things that are visible? He carried this truth with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a hidden document or a secret discovery of alien life. It was the simple, staggering truth that Earth is an island, and we are all its castaways. He felt that the mission to the moon was important, not because of the rocks they brought back, but because of the look back at the home they had left behind. Even in the years following the mission, he remained frustrated that the public's focus was so heavily skewed toward the conquest of space. To him, the real victory was the realization of Earth's unity. He often said that the moon was a great place to view the Earth from, but he would never want to live there. He missed the smell of grass, the sound of wind in the trees, and the feeling of a breeze on his face, things that don't exist in the sterile, airless vacuum of space. He came back from the moon not as a man who wanted to go further into the stars, but as a man who wanted to stay closer to the ground. This epiphany didn't just stay in his head. It dictated how he lived his later years. He chose to spend his time in nature, painting and writing, and advocating for the protection of the planet. He moved away from the high-tech world of aeronautics and toward a more organic, grounded existence. He understood that while we have the technology to leave the Earth, we don't have the technology to replace it. This was the core of his message to the world, that we are all on a spacecraft together, and we are running out of supplies. If the view changed his mind, the path that got him there was paved with a decade of high-stakes gambles. The path of 90% luck. Before he was the man in the lonely orbit, Michael Collins was a creature of pure adrenaline and precision. His trajectory to the moon wasn't some preordained destiny, it was a series of narrow escapes and high-stakes gambles that he famously attributed to blind luck. He started as a classic right stuff test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, a place where the mortality rate was high and the margin for error was non-existent. He spent his days pushing experimental jets to their breaking points, learning the intimate language of machines that were often trying to shake themselves apart. When NASA came calling, he wasn't looking for fame. He was looking for the next fastest thing to fly. His first real taste of the vacuum came with Gemini 10, a mission that turned out to be a pivotal rehearsal for his later moon journey. During Gemini 10, Collins became a spacewalking pioneer, though it was anything but graceful. He had to perform a double rendezvous with two different target vehicles, a feat of orbital mechanics that was essentially like trying to hit a moving bullet with another moving bullet while traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. During his spacewalk, he struggled with a lack of handholds and the physics of zero gravity, famously losing his Hasselblad camera to the void. This experience taught him the most valuable lesson an astronaut can learn. The equipment will fail, the plan will change, and your survival depends entirely on your ability to stay calm when the universe starts throwing curveballs. Despite his mastery, Collins remained refreshingly humble, almost to the point of being a contrarian. In a community of elite pilots, where ego was often used as a shield against fear, he openly admitted that his seat on Apollo 11 was largely a matter of timing. If he hadn't needed surgery for a herniated disc in his neck a year prior, he would have been on the Apollo 8 crew instead. That surgery, which could have ended his career, actually positioned him perfectly for the most famous flight in history. He didn't see himself as a chosen one. He saw himself as a man who had survived 100 different what-if moments to find himself in the right chair at the right time. This sense of luck gave him a unique perspective on the mission itself. He didn't view the Apollo program as a Hollywood drama. He viewed it as a massive, precarious engineering project held together by the sweat of 400,000 people. He was acutely aware that he was just the tip of a very large, very expensive spear. This groundedness allowed him to handle the pressure of the moon landing with a dry wit that his crewmates often appreciated. While the world was hyperventilating about the historical significance of the moon, Collins was usually worried about the temperature of his fuel cells or the precise timing of a thruster fire. His career was defined by this balance of extreme technical competence and a total lack of self-importance. He was the pilot's pilot, the guy who read the manuals twice and never felt the need to brag about his flight hours. He understood that in the cockpit of a spacecraft, your resume doesn't matter. Only your next move does. This philosophy served him well during the tense moments of the Apollo 11 descent, where he had to maintain a perfect orbit while listening to the alarms tripping on the eagle below.
So, as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to ever walk on the moon, but there was a third man on Apollo 11. Michael Collins didn't make headlines for stepping onto the moon, but he was the backbone of the mission.
He was the anchor of the mission, the steady hand that ensured there would be a home to return to. Even after the mission, when the three of them were paraded around the world like rock stars, Collins remained the most skeptical of his own hero status. He found the conquering hero narrative to be slightly absurd. To him, he had just been doing his job, a job that he happened to get because of a series of fortunate breaks and a neck surgery that worked out in his favor. This wasn't modesty for the sake of appearances, it was a genuine reflection of his character. He knew how easily the mission could have gone another way, and he never forgot the thin line between a parade and a funeral. With the mission accomplished and the world at his feet, he faced a choice that most would find impossible to understand: walking away from the spotlight. Most people, after becoming one of the first humans to visit the moon, would spend the rest of their lives chasing that high. For Michael Collins, once was enough. Shortly after returning to Earth and completing the mandatory world tours, he was offered what many considered the ultimate prize: the opportunity to command his own mission, likely Apollo 17. This would have meant he would finally get his chance to walk on the lunar surface, to leave his own footprints in the dust, and to join the exclusive club of moonwalkers. But to the shock of the NASA hierarchy, he said no. His reasoning was simple and deeply human. He was tired. The preparation for a moon mission wasn't just a physical grind. It was an emotional one that pulled him away from his wife and children for years. He realized that the truth of the moon didn't require a second visit to be understood. He had seen the stars from the far side and the Earth from the abyss. He didn't need to kick the dust to feel complete. He chose his family over fame, a move that solidified his reputation as the most grounded man in the astronaut office. He wasn't interested in being a professional hero. He wanted to be a person again. Collins transitioned into a life of public service that was far removed from the cockpit of a rocket. He became the director of the National Air and Space Museum, taking on the monumental task of building the facility on the National Mall. It was a role that required him to be a diplomat and an administrator rather than a pilot.
I used to run around town saying, "Museum on the Mall by the bicentennial." Take those three important facets of Apollo and try to transfer them to the construction of this building.
He excelled at it because he understood the story of flight better than anyone. He didn't want a museum that just celebrated machines. He wanted one that celebrated the human spirit and the curiosity that drives us to look upward. He spent his days ensuring that the history of aviation was preserved for future generations, often walking through the galleries unnoticed by the tourists. In his private life, he turned to the arts. He became a prolific painter and a writer of immense talent. His memoir, Carrying the Fire, is widely regarded as the best book ever written by an astronaut because it lacks the stiff, technical jargon of his peers. He wrote with a conversational, witty, and deeply introspective tone, capturing the sensory details of spaceflight in a way that made the reader feel the vibration of the Saturn V rocket. He preferred the company of his canvas and his family to the banquet halls of Washington. He lived a quiet life in Florida and North Carolina, finding joy in fishing and the simple rhythm of the tides. This refusal to be consumed by his own legend is what made him truly shocking in the context of the 20th century. We are used to our icons burning out or fading away while desperately trying to stay relevant. Collins did neither. He stepped out of the light on his own terms and found a different kind of fulfillment. He proved that you could go to the moon and back and still find the most interesting things in life to be right here on Earth. He didn't need the moon to be his identity. It was just something remarkable he did once in his 30s. As he aged, he became a sort of elder statesman for the planet. He didn't use his platform to push conspiracies or to settle old scores. Instead, he pushed for a renewed focus on Mars and a deeper commitment to protecting the Earth. He remained the third man in the public eye, often left out of the headlines that focused on Armstrong's first step. But he never seemed to mind. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. It allowed him to move through the world with a freedom that his more famous crewmates never quite regained. What does all of this tell us about the man who held the key to the most famous journey in history? The one who stayed behind. Collins never revealed a secret base on the moon or a hidden alien transmission because his truth was much more profound. The mission wasn't about the moon at all. He spent his final years emphasizing that the most important part of Apollo 11 was the realization that humanity is a single crew on a very small ship. He lived long enough to see the world become more fractured and divided, which only made his view from 100,000 miles more relevant. He was the man who went the furthest away to realize what was truly close to home. His legacy isn't found in a footprint, but in a perspective. He taught us that being the one who stayed behind isn't a sign of secondary status, but a position of vital perspective. He was the observer, the protector, and the philosopher of the crew. He showed us that you can be part of something world-changing without needing to be the center of attention. In an age of relentless self-promotion, his life stands as a testament to the power of humility and the importance of the big picture. The shocking truth Michael Collins left behind is that the most alien thing about space is how much it makes you love the Earth. He lived his life with the steady hand of a pilot and the soul of a poet, forever changed by those 48 minutes of silence behind the moon. He knew that we are all, in a way, command module pilots, drifting through a vast darkness, responsible for the life support of our planet, and waiting for the sun to rise over the next horizon. His final orbit may have ended, but the clarity he brought back from the dark side remains our best map for the future. Michael Collins passed away on April 28, 2021, at the age of 90 after a battle with cancer in Naples, Florida. Following a standard waiting period, the loneliest man in history was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on January 30, 2023. His gravesite is located in Section 51, marking the final resting place of a major general and lunar pioneer. While he is no longer with us physically, he remains a singular figure in history, the man who orbited the moon alone so humanity could take its first steps. Michael Collins went the furthest into the void only to realize the Earth was what mattered most. If you appreciated this deep dive into his journey, subscribe for more untold stories.